In this video, I'm going to be going over some common hangups people get when they're first starting to drop primitive shapes. So inside of Modo, there's 5 different ways that you can drop primitive shapes. We're going to be covering all 5 of these ways, and we're going to be using the cube as the example. So the first way that we're going to do it is, notice over here, I have an empty mesh. You can tell that it's empty because the letters mesh are kind of grayed out. I'm going to have that mesh selected. I'm going to hover over the cube primitive. You can see it's just the normal icon, and then I'm going to hold the control key. As soon as I hold the control key, you're going to notice this little ruler pops up. And then I'm just going to left click once, and then let go of the control key. So what just happened was, in the center of the scene, so if I zoom out, I have this little X grid and the Z grid. Over here, you can see now that there's a mesh in the scene, but you can see that the font over here is dark, meaning that somewhere in the scene is a mesh. And what it did was, at world center, it threw in a cube primitive. The other thing that you'll notice is this is kind of a perfect cube, and it's going to be 1 meter tall by 1 meter wide by 1 meter deep. The good thing about this method is it just instantly gives you a cube at the center of your scene. The bad thing is you don't technically get to say how many slices are going through the cube, how tall is the cube, how wide is the cube. You just get a 1 meter by 1 meter cube. So just for the example, I'm going to take this cube, move it over here, make it a little smaller, just so we have something in the scene for reference. So the next way I'm going to make a cube is, again, notice up here we have our single mesh item. It's called mesh, and we have obviously the mesh in the scene. So the next way, what I'm going to do is, instead of holding the control key, I'm going to hold the shift key. So over here you see a little plus gets added. So when I click, what's going to happen is I get that same 1 meter by 1 meter cube. Over here you'll notice though is that little plus that was letting you know that it's going to add a new mesh and put our cube in that mesh, and it actually renamed our mesh from the default of mesh to cube. So if I was to hold shift and click again, there's going to be another cube, and this one, it has a little parentheses 2, just it's the second cube in the scene. In a sense, it just starts numbering them after the first one. So again, the benefits to this one, you get that 1 meter by 1 meter cube. That's kind of a one-click solution, but it throws it into a new mesh. So again, your black wireframe here, this is your inactive mesh. This is your active mesh, or the one you have selected. So if I needed to work on this one, I would just click on this mesh over here, and I would now have access to this one. So again, this method, I get a new mesh item, but I get that same 1 meter cube at the center of the screen. I don't get a chance to change any of its defaults. So let's go ahead, I'm just going to hit this little X button right here. I don't want to save any changes, hit no, and now it just gives me another default scene of an empty mesh item, our camera, and our directional light. So this next way of dropping a cube, this is where it starts to get potentially a little bit confusing, but realistically you just get more settings to choose from. What I'm going to do is, I'm not going to hold a modifier key or anything, I'm just going to left click on our cube. What that's going to do is bring up these tool properties. If these tool properties aren't available, you can click this little button right here, and this little menu you can tear off and do whatever you want with. But if I take a look at these tool properties, the first section here is going to be its position. So this is its position in world space, X, Y, Z. So X is going to be left to right, Y is going to be up and down, Z is going to be kind of back and forward along this blue line right here. Size is that default that I've already stated, 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. Segments are all set to 1. We'll kind of go over these later. But regardless, what I want to focus on is down here, this little button called Apply. So when I hit this button, I'm actually going to create the shape. So left click once, and now I still have the tool active. I have my cube. So what I'm going to do is hit the Escape key or space bar, and that's going to drop the tool. We'll go over the importance of dropping the tool later on in the video. So let's go ahead and kind of reset our scene real quick. So the next way that we're going to create a cube is we're going to just left mouse button click on the cube. We still have all default settings. And what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to hover my mouse or my cursor over the 3D viewport, and then I'm just going to simply right click. And what that's going to do is with these settings right here, insert the cube, again with these settings, into our scene where we tell it to insert. The difference with this one is going to be the tool properties are still active here. So I'm going to do that dropping of the tool by hitting the escape key, and now we have a cube in our scene. So I have my cube. I'll just go ahead and delete this to get an empty scene again. So the fifth and final way of creating a cube is to left click the cube tool and then hover my mouse over the 3D viewport, and then I'm going to left click and drag, and what it's going to do is draw out a plane. So if I rotate around this plane, I can see there's no back side to it, but there is a front side. So if I want to turn this plane into a cube, I click on this little blue cube in the center, click and drag. I'm left clicking and dragging, and it pulls out a cube. So the tool properties are still available over here. I have my position, my size. I could go in and change these if I wanted to, but just know that I have a cube in the scene. It's just a different way of doing it. I'm happy, let's say, with this cube, so I'm going to hit the escape key, drops the tool, and I have my kind of randomly shaped cube in the scene. So this is a more organic way of doing it, clicking and dragging out your cube, but there can be a little bit of complications. So let's just go through this process one more time and just go into more detail about it. So if I left click to activate my cube, and now I can navigate in my 3D viewport without actually clicking and dragging out the cube, but the cube tool is still active. What I want you to pay attention to is this little section down here. So right now, based off my camera angle, it has this little white border that's kind of attached to the Y and the Z axis, or the up and down and the left and right axis. If I start rotating my camera around, you'll notice this little widget will rotate around, but eventually the little white plane is going to snap to two different angles. So let's just rotate this way. Clink, you see it just snapped. So now instead of the X and Y axis, now it's on the Y and Z axis. Now if I rotate up, clink, you see it just switched. Now it's the Z and X axis. So depending on where you're at in your camera, like right here, you can see it's toggling through all three of these very quickly. So when you have the cube active and you left click and drag out, the two axes that it kind of sticks to is going to be effectively highlighted down here. So now I can see kind of the bottom is highlighted. So if I left click and drag, the plane got drawn out on the Z and X axis. So then I can click the little blue cube in the center again and make it a cube. So let's clear that out. So again, left click and drag. I have this bottom one active. If I was to rotate up here, we'll hit escape. So now I have the Y and X axis. Now I left click and drag, and instead of it being kind of on the floor plane, now it's on this back wall plane. So delete that. Cube again, rotate. This clicks over here to this axis. Now I'm drawing it out on this side, and I can click and pull out our cube. So again, this way can be a little bit confusing because it's kind of implementing a lot of different settings at one time. The other disadvantage with drawing out a cube like this is if I was to left click and just really quickly right click and tap, technically I just drew out a cube. Over here you can see our mesh text is dark. I don't see a cube in my scene. Over here there's some settings. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit escape to drop the tool, and you might be able to see it. It's like 1 pixel big, but if I zoom in, you can see right here I have a really, really tiny plane, because again, the first process you draw out a plane, the second process you turn the plane into a cube. So right now I have, and it's even hard to navigate around because it's so small, but I have a very, very tiny plane in the scene, so I'm just going to want to delete that. So again, if you accidentally click when you're going to navigate to change what plane you're working on, you could accidentally draw out a cube that's effectively almost infinitely small that you just never notice in the scene again. So I usually don't recommend this method for drawing out your primitive shapes, but if you're confident of the mechanics of it and you get the hang of it, you can definitely do that method if you prefer. So that's just one example of the hangups that a new user can get. They're just not used to the mechanics yet, and they'll accidentally click, or if they're using something like a trackpad as opposed to a mouse and keyboard, they're just going to accidentally tap their trackpad. It's going to draw out a little shape that they didn't intend to and cause unneeded confusion. So the next thing that we're going to look at is I'm just going to left click on the cube, and what you're going to see is all the properties that I had from the little cube that I just clicked and dragged. All those properties are there. So again, its size, it doesn't have any size on the z-axis because it's effectively just a plane. So what I want to do is under this little tool states menu, I'm just going to left click to open that, and I can click here and pull down. There's a little button called reset. So if I click on that, what's going to happen is it's going to reset to my 1 meter by 1 meter cube. So now I could hit apply. I have a 1 meter cube that I can start working with. So let's clear this cube out. I'm just going to draw out a randomly shaped cube. Here's my weird settings over here. I'm going to hit the spacebar or the escape key to drop the tool. And now what's going to happen is let's just take this little guy. Actually, let's leave him here and we'll hit N for new mesh just so it stays in place. Now if I left click on my cube, it's going to remember those settings just like it did before. So if I was to hit the apply key, I get another cube that's exactly like my first one. We'll just go ahead and delete that. So the first two ways I showed you of making a cube, and that's holding the control key and you get this ruler, or hold the shift key and you get this plus. If you do this method, what it's going to do is just activate the tool. It's going to, in the process of making the cube, hit this reset button before it creates a cube. That's kind of what's happening behind the scenes. So hold control, tap on the cube, I get my perfect little 1 meter by 1 meter cube. So again, same thing, I'm going to hold shift, click on the cube, same 1 meter by 1 meter cube, and up here, my empty mesh, it didn't go into there, it went into this new one, because again, holding the shift key will throw that cube into a new scene. So let's really quickly just go ahead and kind of reset the entire scene. So another point of confusion happens with the concept of dropping the tool. So let's go ahead to make a cube. We're just going to no modifier key left click, and I get all my settings for my cube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the apply tool. And now instead of dropping the tool, what's going to happen is I want to kind of just view my scene. I have one mesh. Its little count down here, this is how many triangles are in the scene. It's currently set to 12. Let's say I hit the apply button again. Now you can see this little GL count jumped up to 24. Let's hit the apply button again. It jumped up another 12. So effectively what happens is every time I click this apply button, it's going to create another another cube based off of these settings. So at this point, I'm going to hit the escape key to drop the tool. Now I'm going to click on the single polygon, and right here you see it says 3 polygons are selected, when in reality it looks like there's only one cube here. The one thing that you might be able to notice though is let's get a single cube and we'll just offset this by a position of 1.5 meters, hit apply. So if I look at these two cubes, and we'll turn the wireframe off, it might be hard to see because of video compression, but this little edge right here, again, this is our single cube, this is our triple cube, I guess. If I click on this, it says 1 edge selected. If I click on this, it says 3 edges selected. But if you notice over here, this one edge is quite a bit darker than this edge over here. And that's intentional. It's Modo trying to tell you, hey, there's multiple things happening here. There's a bunch of edges stacked up on top of each other. So let's just delete that whole mess. Turn on our cube primitive again. So we have position set at 1.5 meters. All the other settings are default. I'm going to hit apply. Now up here, I'm going to just change this back to 0. Hit enter, so it says 0 meters. I'm going to hit apply again, so it just threw in another cube. So now let's go ahead and make the size of it. I'm just going to hit this little thing right here, this little circle that's going to change the size of all these. So let's change it to 1.2 meters and hit enter. But actually, let's have the width set to 0.9. just so it's a little bit different than the cube here. Now I'm going to hit apply. So now you can see that the cube got thrown in. It's a different shape than this cube. So effectively you get both cubes, but you can tell the difference between them. So again, not dropping the tool can lead to some problems depending on what you're clicking, how you're clicking it, and it can just lead to a messy scene. So usually you want to make one primitive, drop the scene, or drop the tool, and then if you want to make another one, click the cube and do it again. You don't have to do it that way, but that's just the way that I recommend because it can be a little bit confusing at first. So if you just do it one tool to one primitive, it can potentially be easier. So let's just go ahead and clear the scene real quick. So our other way of creating a cube was to left click, hover over the 3D viewport, and right click. So you might think that right clicking is the exact same as hitting the apply button, but technically it's not. So let's go ahead and clear the scene out. So let's dive into the differences between right click to place an object and the apply button. So again, I left click to select the tool. It has all the settings. They're just set to default at this time. If I right click, what's going to happen is this can be seen as almost like an active tool. And the way that you can tell this is it has all these little widgets. So let's zoom in a little bit to make the widgets more apparent. It gives you these arrows, and these let you move the cube, and over here you can see the position is changing. You can move the cube on all three axes. And you can also change the shape and the size of the cube. And as I'm changing these, you can see over here the shapes are changing. So let's just quickly hit the reset button, and you can see that it kind of goes back to the default. Let's go ahead and delete this cube. So using the apply button, left click, all default settings, I hit the apply button. What happens is I don't get any of those widgets. It just drops down a shape, and it kind of is what it is. Spacebar to drop the tool, delete the cube. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different ways that you can get a cube into your scene and then modify that cube. And then there's a bunch of different ways you can accidentally screw it up if you're not really doing things correctly. So what I like to do is just do the method where you hold Control, tap the cube, and then you can start working. So I mentioned it before, but usually the biggest problem that new users have is they either won't fundamentally understand the 5 different ways of dropping a cube. They just think, I want to drop a cube, there's one way of doing it. And they sometimes get a little bit of the other ways that kind of interfere with the way that they think that it works. So just not fully understanding the process is usually a pretty big hurdle. The other big hurdle that makes dropping primitive shapes a little bit complicated, or just using Modo in general a little bit complicated, is not fully understanding or being used to your input devices. So if you accidentally left click when you should have right clicked, in Modo, left click and right click are 2 different things, and they 100% matter. A left click will do something completely different than a right click will do. The next thing would be if you're using a trackpad, it's very easy to just accidentally tap the trackpad when you go to actually make a movement. So you do like a little tap and then move, and that'll register as a left click and then a movement of the mouse. So again, using kind of an inaccurate input device can be a problem. And that same thing can happen when you use a Wacom pen. If you accidentally tap the surface of your tablet, it's going to register as a left click when you may not want it to be a left click. Other potential problems could be the use of Magic Mouse made by Apple. Those, realistically, they're made for simplicity's sake. It's for browsing the web and just doing things that grandma would do on the computer. Grandma doesn't need right click, grandma doesn't need middle click, grandma just needs left click. So that's the easy one to get to. You can program in the other clicks, but how reliable they are is a little bit iffy. It's just kind of a thing that even if you're using a normal mouse, if you're using a Wacom pen, if you're using that Magic Mouse that I just mentioned, you're eventually just going to get used to your input devices, and that's just going to turn into muscle memory. And the more you kind of know exactly what you're doing and you're used to your input devices, the better off you're going to be. But again, when you're first starting out and you're not really used to navigating in Modo where you're holding the Control and the Alt and the Shift keys to move around, it can be a little bit much to take in at one time. But realistically, you should never find yourself constantly performing the wrong inputs when working. If you are accidentally right-clicking when you should be left-clicking, and you've been using the program for a good amount of time, you might want to consider changing your input devices that you're using. So hopefully this video has helped clear up any confusion around the creation of primitive shapes inside of Modo. I know there's 5 different ways of inputting them, and it can be a little bit confusing and it can take a while to get used to. But once you understand how the process works in Modo, and you're accurately inputting commands into your computer, you'll find that the process is quite simple and intuitive.